Hi, this presentation is about Napoleon. And Napoleon, arguably one of the most important leaders in history. He comes to power at the tail end of the French Revolution. He becomes Emperor of France, and he leads his armies all across Europe, conquers most of the countries in Europe. Eventually, he's defeated by the Brits and the Russians. And he is responsible, arguably, for bringing liberal philosophy all across Europe. And not to mention, he brings the Napoleonic Code, which still remains the basis of much of the law codes in Europe, and introduces promotion by merit, which means that people in the countries he conquered, at least briefly, could get jobs based on their ability and not based on whether or not they were born into noble families. So Napoleon's born in Corsica, and Corsica is a small island off the coast of Italy. And really, until a few years before Napoleon's born, Corsica is Italian. And that's one of the two reasons why Napoleon is teased so much as a kid. The other reason being that compared to many of the other kids at school, Napoleon was a little on the short side. And so Napoleon is teased through his childhood because he talks funny in an Italian accent and because he's not particularly big. Napoleon is, however, fairly brilliant, arguably a genius, and he expresses this ability in school. Napoleon's parents are actually driven off the island of Corsica because they engage. Napoleon's born into a noble family with not a heck of a lot of money, but they end up at war with one of the other noble families on Corsica, and they are driven off. Napoleon's father, Charles Bonaparte, who we don't have a picture of, it's hard to find him on the internet, but there he is. Charles' father, he works for Louis XVI, and he works at Versailles, right? And the important thing about this is Versailles is really beautiful, and Charles sees that not only is Versailles an awesome place to work, it's great to be a noble, but he sees how important it is for a person's career to be close to the king and work their way up, work up the chain of command, so to speak, by granting favors at Versailles, or by getting close to the king. Along these same lines, to help Napoleon become a career-minded person and to become successful in life, Napoleon's dad enters him in a military school. And this is important because at a military school, and in the military in general, a person has much more probability of being promoted by merit, as in being promoted by what they're good at. And Napoleon, being an excellent tactician, excels at school and graduates at the top of his class. Graduates in 1785. Very quickly he becomes a commander. He's forced to leave Corsica, as we talked about before, engaging in a battle with a noble family. In 1795, and here, because I'm sick of putting pictures of Napoleon up, we got Napoleon Dynamite here, not actually related to Napoleon, but funny picture. So Napoleon in 1795, he's an artillery commander in the French army. And in 1795, the Directory is in charge of France. And the Directory, if you remember, is the government that comes to power after the National Convention voluntarily steps down after the Reign of Terror. And the Directory is really unpopular and fairly weak. And very early on, like within the first year of their establishment, they're threatened by mob violence in Paris that wants to overthrow their government. And Napoleon's skills as an artillery commander are called upon to try to stop this rebellion. And Napoleon actually crushes this rebellion, this revolt in the middle of Paris by firing a whole bunch of grape shot, which is small balls out of cannons, into a crowd of poorly armed or unarmed, really angry people. It kills about 1,000 people with a couple of shots, and the Directory is saved, which leads Napoleon very quickly to make the rank of general. As a general, Napoleon travels to Austria. He defeats the Austrians with his army and single-handedly writes up the peace treaty with Austria, which is actually illegal. Really, only the Directory is supposed to be able to do that. But Napoleon essentially presents himself as the French government, gets a peace treaty signed, which is so beneficial to France that the Directory overlooks the fact that he did this illegally. They send him to Egypt, where he leads an army against the British in Egypt. And the reason that Egypt is so important is because if you control Egypt, you control the waterway between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, the Suez Canal. And if Napoleon can take over that, then he can cut off essentially the supply line to England, who is still fighting France in the war. Napoleon is blockaded in Egypt by the British, and he essentially has no hope of winning. And so, instead of staying behind and losing with his troops, Napoleon actually escapes, leaves his troops in Egypt to be defeated, and heads back in secret to France, where he leads a coup against the Directory and takes over. He becomes first consul in the new government. There's 3 consuls. Napoleon is the first one and eventually has dictatorial powers. And eventually in 1804 he becomes the Emperor of France. And in this ceremony you see here, it's a kind of a excuse me, a funny story in history, and it goes back to Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, and the last real emperor of Europe. And Charlemagne is a German guy, and he actually, the French claim him as French, the Germans claim him as German, and he unifies all of Europe, and the Pope invites, and the Pope you can see pictured here, and this is Napoleon pictured over here. The Pope invites, here's Napoleon, here's the Pope. Charlemagne, in Christmas Day 800, is invited to the Vatican in Rome to attend church service presided over by the Pope. The Pope at this point was the most powerful guy in Europe. And the Pope, as Charlemagne is kneeling down and praying, the Pope pulls out a crown that he had hidden behind the altar, and he places the crown on Charlemagne's head. And at that moment, all of the crowd in the church, who had been practiced before, they yell out and cheer for Charlemagne, the new emperor of Europe. And what the Pope was essentially doing by putting the crown on Charlemagne's head was he was telling Charlemagne that the Pope, and not Charlemagne, was the most powerful guy in Europe, and actually made Charlemagne pretty mad. Well, Napoleon here reads his history, and Napoleon knew what happened to Charlemagne. So Napoleon invites the Pope to France for his ceremony to be crowned as emperor. And while the Pope is holding on to the crown at the first part of the ceremony, Napoleon takes the crown away from the Pope and places it on his own head, and he crowns himself Emperor of Europe. And this doesn't make the Pope happy, but at this point Napoleon is so much more powerful than the Pope that the Pope can't do anything but bless Napoleon's rule, which at one point makes Napoleon Emperor of Europe. And on the other point, remember, 98% of France are Catholics, and so by the Pope participating in this crowning ceremony, he gives the Catholic endorsement to the rule of Napoleon, which unifies once again the French government with the Catholic. Napoleon's first loss, or really important loss, besides what you could say in Egypt, comes at the Battle of Trafalgar. And at the Battle of Trafalgar, the British Navy, which is seen here in these 2 lines, defeats the French Navy combined with the Spanish Navy, which is seen as lined up here. And the British Navy, the British fleet is led by Admiral Lord Nelson, pictured here. And Nelson is badly outnumbered by the combined Spanish and French fleet. His main advantage is actually that most of the French officer corps, their naval officer corps, the people who had a lot of experience in battle, were killed during the Terror. And so the the French fleet is led predominantly by the Spanish, and the Spanish, they don't particularly want to fight for the French that hard. And Nelson uses an unorthodox tactic in attacking Napoleon's fleet here. Essentially, naval tactics at this time said that you sailed up broadside of the ship, so you would sail up so this part of your ship was pointing at the enemy's side of the ship, and you'd blast each other to death with cannons, because your cannons are all pointing out the side like this, right? But what Nelson does is instead he sails his fleet straight at the French lines. Now this is really dangerous because as he approaches, he can't fire any of his guns at these ships, right, because they're all pointing to the side, but as he closes in, the enemy, the Spanish and the French, will be able to fire all his guns at his ship. So it's a really risky maneuver. But what Nelson wants to do is he wants to divide this line into 3 sections, and specifically what he wants to do is break the enemy's flagship away from the rest of the fleet, right? And flagships are the ships that use flags to signal the rest of the Navy, the rest of the ships, right? This is before electronic communication, before even electric lights, and so people would hold up flags to signal different movements, and so if you take out the flagship, then nobody in the other ships knows what to do. And so Nelson sails straight at the French line, he splits it in 3, he sinks their flagship, and he crushes the combined French and Spanish Navy. And while the British don't lose any ships in this fight, Nelson himself is mortally wounded, and he dies before the end of the battle. Or actually, I think he lives just long enough to hear that they're victorious, and then he dies. So it's a great victory for the British, it's a crushing loss for Napoleon, and what this really means is that the British are going to maintain control of the sea. Which is really important because Britain, is an island, and as long as they control the seas, that means Napoleon cannot invade. So Napoleon's next plan is called the Continental Blockade. Okay? And the Continental Blockade means that Napoleon is going to try to force all the countries in Europe not to trade with Britain. Britain's an island, they need to get all their supplies from Europe, and so if none of the Europeans will send any supplies to the British will starve out and surrender to Napoleon. Unfortunately for Napoleon, the Russians choose really immediately to go against the Continental Blockade and start trading with the British. Now Napoleon at this point had not invaded Russia because Russia is so big he wanted to avoid it, but when Russia starts trading with the British, Napoleon realizes that if the Russians don't suffer consequences for their infraction of the Continental Blockade, then the rest of Europe will follow suit. As a result, Napoleon invades Russia. He invades before the winter, but the Russians, in their wisdom, they use a burn and retreat policy called a scorched earth policy. So they light all their crops on fire and they retreat. And pretty soon Napoleon finds himself deep inside Russia with no food because all the crops are burned, and then his soldiers start to starve to death and freeze to death, as you see here. And so Napoleon ends up starving and dying in Russia, and so he has no choice but to go back home, at which point the Russians start to attack. And the Russians attack, and they follow Napoleon all across Europe, and all the other European countries who Napoleon had previously defeated join in with the Russians, and Napoleon driven back to Paris. He left for Russia with about 100,000 troops. He returns to Paris with less than 10,000. He is defeated, and for a punishment, the old kings of Europe exile him to Elba. They sent him to this beautiful island off the coast of Spain, where he has about 1,500 people to serve him. Napoleon is made king of this little island, and the only thing that he cannot do is he cannot go back to France. That is against the rules. But Napoleon cannot help himself. He feels like the French people need him, and he goes back and raises an army in France. He fights the He's defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. And the next time he is exiled to St. Helena, which is a cold and wet rocky island off the coast of southern Africa, where he died in 1821. And that's really it for Napoleon. And so Napoleon dies kind of a sad death, but remember, he does bring the Napoleonic Code to Europe, which unifies all Europeans under one rule of law. And remember, that's Beccaria's idea, and the Napoleonic Code in many ways still lasts till today. And Napoleon is also responsible for bringing liberal and revolutionary ideas to all the countries in Europe. And this is kind of ironic because Napoleon ruled with absolute power, but ideas of democracy and freedom and equality are really brought to these countries by Napoleon, who brings all those Enlightenment philosophers' writings to the Europeans. And not long after Napoleon dies in 1848, another wave of revolutions washes across Europe. And most of them are crushed, but nonetheless the liberal ideas are there to stay and can be seen as somewhat responsible for the democracies that persist in Europe today. Thank you. Hi, this presentation is about Napoleon. And Napoleon, arguably one of the most important leaders in history. He comes to power at the tail end of the French Revolution. He becomes Emperor of France, and he leads his armies all across Europe, conquers most of the countries in Europe. He's so much as a kid. The other reason being that compared to many of the other kids at school, Napoleon was a little on the short side. And so Napoleon is teased through his childhood because he talks funny in an Italian accent, and Napoleon's born in Corsica. And Corsica is a small island off the coast of Italy. And really, until a few years before Napoleon's born, Corsica is Italian. And that's one of the two reasons why Napoleon is teased. Eventually, he's defeated by the Brits and the Russians. And he is responsible, arguably, for bringing liberal philosophy all across Europe. And not to mention, he brings the Napoleonic Code, which still remains the basis of much of the law codes in Europe, and introduces promotion by merit, which means that people in the countries he conquered, at least briefly, could get jobs based on their ability and not based on whether or not they were born into noble families. So Napoleon